The fuel gauges on the B-17 Flying Fortress are dancing near zero. Captain Bill Cherry stares through the cockpit glass at a horizon that offers nothing but a flat, endless blue. Behind him, in the cramped fuselage, sits the most famous man in America, Eddie Rickenbacker. He isn't a soldier anymore. He's a 52-year-old civilian consultant with a secret mission for the Secretary of War. But right now, his fame means nothing. The four massive engines of the old 434 begin to sputter. One by one, they die. The sudden silence is terrifying. The only sound left is the whistling of the wind against the aluminum skin of the bomber as it begins to glide toward the water. "Set her down easy, Bill," Rickenbacker says. The plane hits the Pacific at 90 miles an hour. The impact is like slamming into a brick wall. Water erupts through the nose. The tail section breaks. The men have minutes to escape before the heavy bomber drags them into the abyss. They scramble for the rafts, tossing them into the churning wake as the blue water swallows the wings. As the ripples settle, 8 men are left bobbing in 3 tiny rubber toys, thousands of miles from help, with no food, no water, and no idea where they are. Welcome World War II Obscura. To understand the stakes of this mission, you have to understand Eddie Rickenbacker. In 1942, he was a living legend. He was the ace of aces from World War I, a man who had notched 26 aerial victories and earned the Medal of Honor. He was a professional race car driver who had looked the Grim Reaper in the eye more times than any man alive. Just a year earlier, he had survived a horrific commercial airline crash in Atlanta that should have killed him. He was iron-willed, famous, and wealthy, the president of Eastern Airlines. So when Secretary of War Henry Stimson needed a personal message delivered to General Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific, he chose Rickenbacker. The mission was so secret that the crew of the B-17 didn't even know what was in the letter that Eddie carried in his pocket. The crew was a mix of veterans and young men. Captain Bill Cherry was the pilot. James Whitaker was the co-pilot. Hans Adamson was Rickenbacker's aide and old friend. John Bartek was the flight engineer. John DeAngelis was the navigator. James Reynolds was the radio man. Then there was Alex Kaczmarek. Alex was a young sergeant, a ground crewman who had just been released from the hospital after an appendectomy. He was supposed to be catching a ride to his new station. Instead, he was about to enter a month-long nightmare. The disaster began with a simple math error. A faulty octant and a strong tailwind caused the plane to overshoot its refueling stop at Canton Island. By the time they realized they were lost, they were out of gas. When they ditched on October 21st, 1942, the survival kits, which were supposed to be packed with food and water, were lost in the chaos of the sinking plane. All they managed to salvage were 4 oranges, a few flares, a couple of fishing lines with no bait. They had no hats, no sunscreen, and just the clothes on their backs. The 8 men divided into 3 rafts. Cherry, Whitaker, and Reynolds took the first. Rickenbacker, Adamson, and Bartek took the second. DeAngelis and the sickly Alex Kaczmarek took the smallest, trailing behind. They tied the rafts together with 100 feet of rope, forming a fragile line across the swells. The first few days were a psychological war. The Pacific sun was brutal. It didn't just tan the skin, it cooked it. The men described the glare off the water as, quote, billions of sharp splinters of light. Every time they looked at the horizon, it felt like needles were being driven into their eyes. Without hats, their scalps were blistered and broke open. Their feet, soaked in salt water, began to swell and rot. By day, they prayed for the night. By night, the temperature plummeted, and the spray from the waves left them shivering in a state of near hypothermia. Daytimes, we prayed for the coldest of the nights, one wrote. Nighttime, we craved the sun. By the 5th day, the 4 oranges were gone. The hunger was a dull ache, but the thirst was a screaming demon. Their tongues swelled until they could barely speak. They tried to suck on the buttons of their shirts to trigger saliva growth. Some considered drinking the salt water, but Rickenbacker, the man who had survived everything, forbade it. He knew that salt water was a death sentence. He began to take charge, not because he had the rank, but because he had the will. He watched the others, looking for the first signs of cracking. On their 8th day, a miracle happened. It was a moment that would define the rest of their lives. The men were drifting in a stupor, their heads lolling on their chests. Suddenly, Rickenbacker felt something land on his head. It was a seagull. The bird sat there calm as if it had found a piece of driftwood. The other men watched, frozen. Nobody breathed. Slowly, with the precision of a hunter, Rickenbacker's hand reached up. He grabbed the bird by its legs. The squawking and fluttering was the loudest sound they'd heard in a week. He wrung its neck, stripped the feathers, and divided the raw, oily meat into 8 equal portions. It was barely a mouthful each. They tasted of fish and decay, but to them it was a feast. More importantly, they used the bird's intestines as bait. Within minutes, they caught a small mackerel. For the first time since the crash, they had a spark of hope. But hope is a fickle thing in the middle of the ocean. The heat returned, fiercer than before. The men's skin was now a mass of sores. Sharks began to follow the rafts, their gray fins slicing through the water just inches from the rubber. Sometimes a shark would bump the bottom of the raft, lifting the men 3 or 4 inches into the air. The men lived in a constant terror that a single bite would deflate their world and leave them to the predators. As the second week dragged on, the group's dynamic began to shift. Eddie Rickenbacker realized that the men were slipping into a lethal lethargy. They were waiting to die. Hans Adamson, his oldest friend, was failing fast. The young Alex Kazmarek was even worse. His body was rejecting what little food they found and was beginning to hallucinate. Rickenbacker decided that if he couldn't lead them with kindness, he would lead them with rage. He began to insult the men. He called them cowards. He mocked their weakness. He became a holy terror, a driving, snarling force of personality. He purposefully made himself the villain. He knew that if the men hated him, they would stay alive just to spite him. They would wake up every morning thinking, I'm going to outlive that son of a bitch. It was a brutal, calculated form of psychological leadership. He wouldn't let them sleep too long. He forced them to pray together every evening using a small New Testament Bible that Johnny Bartek had carried in his pocket. The most agonizing struggle was the water. They would watch rain clouds form on the horizon, dark and heavy with life-saving moisture, only to see the wind push them away. When a squall finally hit, it was a frantic, desperate scene. The men would strip off their shirts, soak them in the rain, then wring the dry, salty, crusted water to their mouths. It was a tea of sweat, salt, and rubber, but it was like nectar to these dying men. For Alex Kazmarek, it wasn't enough. On the 13th night, the youngest among them reached his limit. The men in the other rafts heard a low, rhythmic moaning. Alex was calling for his mother. He was drifting in and out of consciousness, his breath coming in ragged rasps. The Angelus held him, trying to keep his head above the water that pulled in the bottom of the small raft. By dawn, the moaning had stopped. The ocean was silent. The men watched as DeAngelis and Whitaker stripped the body of its meager belongings and rolled Alex into the cold Pacific. There was no ceremony. There were no words, just the sight of a young man vanishing into the blue. The death of Alex broke something in the group. Tensions boiled over. Captain Bill Cherry, the pilot, decided he couldn't take Rickenbacker's bullying anymore. He wanted to strike out on his own. On the 21st day, Cherry took the smallest raft and rowed away into the mist. A day later, Whitaker, DeAngelis, and Reynolds did the same in another raft. Rickenbacker was left in the remaining raft with nearly comatose Hans Adamson and the mechanical engineer Johnny Bartek. They were splintered, broken, and dying. Rickenbacker sat in the stern, his face covered by a ragged handkerchief to hide the sores. Looking like a down-at-the-heels bandit, his body had wasted away to nearly nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on the horizon. On the 23rd day, Bartek heard a sound. It wasn't the wind. It was the rhythmic hum of an engine. He feebly lifted his head and saw two tiny specks in the sky, Navy Kingfisher scout planes. The men waved their tattered shirts, screaming with voices that were a little more than croaks. The planes circled, but then they turned away. The spare hit like a physical blow. The men collapsed back into the raft, convinced they had seen their last chance vanish. But the pilots had seen them. The next day, a Kingfisher spotted by Lieutenant William Eady spotted Rickenbacker's raft again. The water was too rough for a standard rescue. The swells were massive, and a landing risked flipping the plane and killing everyone. But Eady didn't care. He brought the Kingfisher down in a daring, bouncing landing that nearly tore the pontoons off. When the plane taxied toward the raft, Eady saw the three figures that barely looked human. They were skeletal, blackened by the sun, and covered in salt-crusted sores. Rickenbacker, the man who refused to die, stood up in the bobbing raft. He reached out grabbed the wake of the plane. "Just call me Eddie, boys," he croaked, "but get me out of this damn boat." The Kingfisher was a two-seater. It couldn't fit 3 extra men. Eady made a choice. He put Adamson and Bartek in the cockpits and lashed Rickenbacker to the wing with parachute silk. He then taxied across the open ocean for miles, the ace of aces clinging to the exterior of the plane as waves battered him until they met a Navy PT boat. All 7 of the remaining men were eventually found. Whitaker's group had washed up on a small island and had been found by natives. Cherry had been spotted by another plane. Against every law of probability, they had survived 24 days in the most desolate stretch of the Pacific. When Rickenbacker finally returned to the United States, he was a different man. He'd lost 40 pounds. His hair had turned gray, but he hadn't forgotten the mission. He insisted on finishing his journey. Even before he saw his wife, he reported to the Secretary of War. Then he flew back to the Pacific to deliver that secret message to MacArthur. History never revealed what was in the letter, but his mission was complete. This story reveals the brutal, unvarnished reality of what World War II asked of individuals. It wasn't all glory and medals. Sometimes it was just the sheer ugly will to survive. Eddie Rickenbacker wasn't a saint on those rafts. He was a tyrant. He was a bully. And he was exactly what those men needed to keep them from slipping into the dark. He taught them that faith, not just in a higher power, but in each other and their own stubborn refusal to quit, could achieve the impossible. The story of those 24 days reminds us that history is made of flesh and blood. It's made of young men like Alex Kaczmarek, who gave everything to a sea that didn't care. And it's made of legends like Rickenbacker, who proved that the Hewitt Spirit is the only thing tougher than the Pacific. If you want to see more forgotten stories, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment with a person or mission you think I should cover next. Thank you for watching, and remember, history is larger than we could ever imagine.
We lived on a small rubber raft for 21 days on the broad expanse of the Pacific with only 4 scrawny little oranges. Johnny Bartek in my raft happened to have an issue Bible in his pocket, and soon we organized morning and evening prayers, praying for our deliverance. Our prayers were answered, and if we hadn't had, or I hadn't had 7 witnesses, I wouldn't dare tell the story. For a seagull landed on my head and gave us food to sustain us for 2 days and sufficient bait through the use of its intestines in order